Welcome to Eno and Rob. Thank you for joining us. And we have Angela, Janine, Maya, Natalie, and Carmen here. So let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 5 out of 8. And I sent Rob and Eno kind of a little introduction to everybody. So, and of course, some of you know, in fact, many of you know them. And I just thought it'd be fun to have them in conversation. And I just briefly show a few books off, just so you can see them. So Eno, I don't actually have A is for Activist, which is kind of crazy, but I have his longer books like My Night at the Planetarium, or The Wedding Portrait, or M is for Movement, the latest, right?
Yep.
And then inclusion in collections like this, We Are the Change, got a piece in there. So I'm gonna have them both, ask them to introduce themselves and then talk to each other, but just it's fun to always see stuff. Rob, author illustrator, and they're both author illustrators, which is cool too. Furqan's first, is it Furqan? Want to get the name right.
Furqan.
Furqan's first flat top. One of a Kind Like Me, illustrated with Janine Macbeth's own Blood Orange Press and written by Lauren Maeno. I Am Saucil Creek, which is by, blanking, Melissa Reyes. And then Sam is the latest one that came out with Penny Candy Books, if I'm getting that right. So anyway, would you guys be able to kind of briefly just say a little bit about yourselves and then talk to each other for about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up. But if people want to ask questions along the way, I think that's fine too, right? So we'll go alphabetically by first name. Eno, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I mean, Rob and I didn't talk about this ahead of time, so I'm not sure sort of, what is useful to you all. I know some of you have a lot, if not more, experience in this world than I do. So I was thinking we would maybe just share a bit of what our journey has been, how we kind of got to where we're at as authors and illustrators and all that. And then, go from there. Does that sound right? Or is there other things in particular folks would like us to focus on before to sort of launch into my history?
Yeah, does anybody want to share? Is there anything in particular that you would love to hear from Rob and Eno about?
You can also put stuff in the chat as well.
Yeah. And go along as you go too. I think, why don't you guys just get started, and then, people feel free to just butt in or put stuff in the chat. This is a small group.
Yeah, please do. Well, I guess, my story is that I was not somebody who thought they would be a children's book author. I'm a graphic designer, activist. Graphics has been my life for the last 30 years. And I worked in printing, and I worked in graphic design. I started Design Action Collective, which is a worker-owned co-op union design studio. So I've been doing all sort of visual communications for a long time. I also happen to live in a co-housing community, and my kid was born in 2010, was the youngest of 8 kids in our community. And I've been reading a lot of children's books to kids. The oldest kids now are all off to college, so I've been reading books to them all along. And how it is with children's books, you end up reading them over and over and over and over again. And I was wanting to find the book that I wanted to read to my kid over and over and over again. And our neighbors had this, they're architects, and they had this book about these architects counting and architect shapes kind of books. And I was like, how come architects have a book for themselves, but we don't have one, for what our family does, which was largely, organizing and activism. So that's when A is for Activist came up as an idea. I ended up writing that with some help originally, just sort of brainstorming ideas. And then I spent a whole bunch of time writing and rewriting. And the idea was I was going to publish it, just, print it myself for friends and family, maybe make it a Christmas present, but found out to make it a board book that was over 10 pages, I had to actually get it printed. And then sort of things snowballed from there, where I ended up going, well, maybe if I'm going to print it, I should print 1,000. Well, if I'm going to do 1,000, I might as well do 2,000 and see, if, I had this whole plan where I was going to sell them, you know, I borrowed money from people. I was going to pay them back over a 5-year period on this sort of really only as I could kind of payback schedule, which was really nice that I had people who were willing to give me these micro loans for that. But I figured after 5 years, I was going to end up putting it on a credit card. This was just going to be a pile of books that I was going to have for a long time. But as it turns out, the book, I was sort of underestimating how many people were interested in a book like that. And the original print run went pretty quickly. And then I had to decide, am I going to keep on doing this thing where every evening I'm going on, checking my website, seeing how many orders I've got, going, packaging them, printing out mailing labels, going to the mailbox every morning kind of thing, or is there potentially somebody else who would do that for me? In other words, a publisher. And I knew nothing about sort of the whole publishing world, and I didn't think that it would be a problem because all the bookstores that did carry it were all saying, this is selling really well, you should get a publisher, it'd make it easier for us. But as it turns out, I guess there was a whole, this was some years ago, I think this may have changed, but the orthodoxy was that if self-published books were like poison to publishers, they would never take a published book that had already been published. So I had no idea that that was the case. So I sent it out to people and nobody would take it on, except for 2 publishers even got back to me. One of them wanted to do it in a way that didn't really make sense for the book for me. And then the other one is Seventh Stories Press, and they had already done this with What Makes a Baby with Corey Silverberg's book, and who had also self-published and then gotten things. So they were kind of doing something different from a lot of publishers at the time. I think their experience actually has led other publishers to not be so reticent to consider that now, but at the time it was like kiss of death. And so as for Activists got out in the world and was successful, and then it became this, what's your next book going to be? And it's like, I'm not really a children's book author. I just wrote 1 book. That doesn't make me an author. And so if the right idea comes up, I'll do it, but I don't feel like I should do a book just because I did another book. And then the idea of counting on community came about. And I'm sort of going on, so maybe I won't go through all sort of my books and how I got to each one of them, but short story is I ended up sort of finding myself in this children's book world, writing books that follow my kid's age. So my last book, Emmys for Movement, is a middle grade, early middle grade book because he's now about to enter 5th grade. And when I was writing that, he was reading chapter books. And although my next book actually is back to picture books. So it's going to be, it's highly illustrated chapter book. So it's, partially because he's somewhat of a reluctant reader, I wanted to do something that had a lot of images, big text, that kind of thing. But then, my next book is actually, Oh, the Things We Are For, is actually going to be back to more like a rhyming picture book. So now I'm sort of fully in that world. I guess I'm writing books that don't just follow my kid's age. So that's me, Rob. Your turn.
Okay, sorry, I was just getting my screen together. No matter how many times I hear it, I always love hearing that story. My name is Rob Liu-Trujillo. You can call me Rob. So my journey was when I was about 26 years old, 25 years old. I was a young father, very young, and I was frustrated that my kid, there weren't very many books about mixed kids like him, and there weren't very many about kids like myself. And at the time, I didn't think anything political about it. I was just like, this kind of sucks, So I just decided to go back to school, get my degree in illustration, and I was living in Oakland at the time, and then I went back to school and went to New York and lived in the East Coast for a while, and started sending my postcards out and doing all that regular legwork. And then I tracked down an editor, like a really big time editor she was at HarperCollins, and I tracked her down and was like amazed that I was able to do that. But looking back, I know that I was not ready at the time, but still, I didn't really understand, you know, all of what the publishing industry was like. And so I just took a lot of time, instead of sending work out, to just really practice and work on writing, work on drawing and painting and all that stuff. And that was super important and very helpful. And I think the biggest thing has been just building with people, you know, meeting Eno, meeting Janine, I mean, I know so many of the people on this call. It's really awesome to see family here. I think this the biggest thing, and the place where I've learned the most is just by building with other people and like seeing what they do, and asking for advice, asking questions, things like that. But around the time that I, you know, was, you know, finishing school, I had been sending stuff out and was getting a little bit frustrated that I wasn't hearing any callbacks, which is, you know, as I know now, 10 years later, it's really common for you to send tons of stuff out and not get any response. And that is because publishers are kind of in like a bottleneck, many of the big ones anyway, where so many people send them stuff that, you know, they often don't have time to look through it all. And what they usually do is go through, you know, friends of friends and connections and industry events, and, you know, what's popping in front of them, whether it be a blog or a radio show, or basically someone who catches their eye or gets in front of their attention, has been my experience. So at that time, I also, it was really cool that Laura had Zedit on here, because around that time I found her work and found her books, and like the research that she was doing about statistics and, you know, talking about who was being included and who wasn't, was like so gratifying to see, because I just thought I was, you know, crazy. Like, you know, I must be whack. My stuff must be garbage otherwise. And then I saw her stuff and I was like, oh, it makes sense. But yeah, so first thing I did was illustrate a picture book for a company called Arte Publico, which is the biggest Latino publisher in the US. They're based in Texas. And that was cool. And then this funny thing is, when I did that book, it was at that point where I made the decision to do things on my own and self-publish. And it was at that time that Eno was doing his book and Janine was doing her book. And I was like, wow, they can do it. I can do it too. And so, you know, I basically went through the motions of asking them questions, bugging them a lot, and then, you know, taking down notes, and then just doing a lot of research about how to, you know, publish it. And I mean, there's so many hats that you have to wear in order to make a book. Like, it's making it is only half of it, and like selling it and promoting it is the other half. Like, there's just so many things to learn. And I'm glad that I did it the hard way, because it gave me a little bit more leverage when approaching publishers and companies later, to be like, you know, I know something. So yeah, I did that book. And then I worked with Melissa Reyes, the book that she just showed, I Am Salsa Creek. Then I self-published my book for Khan, and then it just kind of snowballed, working with Janine and then working with so many other people. So that's my story in a nutshell. And you can feel free to, you know, put questions in the chat and I'll answer more specifically.
Excellent. All right. Well, why don't you guys just ask each other some questions first?
I can go.
Okay, you go.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you said that you got into it because, you know, you were looking for books for Saja, and they weren't you couldn't find what you're looking for. But I guess I feel like there's sort of there's not being able to find the book you're looking for, and then there's going to school, and then sending out, you know, becoming an illustrator, and then later an author. It's sort of, had you always, you know, thought of children's books as a thing you were going to get into, or like what made that something you were passionate about as opposed to just something you were angry about?
Well, I didn't mention this to the folks who don't know me on the call. Is I'm a visual artist. I've been a painter, illustrator for a long time. So even before doing the kids books, I had been working on murals and illustration and things like that. But I think what I was passionate about was storytelling, and so I really didn't know how I was going to go about doing storytelling. So whether it was going to be in animation or film, or if it was going to be in comics or in kids books, I just wasn't sure. And I think that I was so frustrated about the type of books that I was getting as a parent around the time when my kid was just a baby, that I was like, this is something where it's tangible. I think I can put my all into it. And the more I started to go down the rabbit hole of like looking for books that I thought were cool and finding some and then not finding other ones, I was like I became more and more kind of like what's the word? Not a lunatic, but very, very crazy about it. And any of my friends will tell you that I was just talking their ear off about it. Because in my peer group of like homies and friends, like none of them were into that. So they were just like, please stop, just please. But yeah, that's how I went from like that point to the other.
Had you worked with kids much before, or were you thrown into it because of Saja mostly?
I think for little kids, I was thrown into it because of my son, Saja, but I was a teacher. I was a teaching artist. So I've been working with elementary, junior high school, and high school students for a while, pretty much from around the age when he was born up until he was about 8 years old or something like that. So almost a decade I worked, teaching with kids. But picture book specifically, it was because of him and, him being a little kid.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting because for me, I came up with kids around, and but I've never been an educator. I live with a bunch of teachers, and so I've always you guys know your teachers, that's a whole nother level, right? And people are always saying, oh, if you're a children's book author, you're also an educator, but right. You're not, or I'm not, and for me, the thing that I wasn't very confident about originally was, I knew my kid and I knew the kids in my community, but whether or not this was going to be something that was going to be good for kids outside of my circles, so Angela asked a question about sort of the importance of the community question, and for me, being able to use, my community and then the extended community beyond that as a way to get feedback on the children's books was very important, especially early on. I later on found myself in classrooms a lot, which people who knew me before would be shocked at. But as it turns out, especially when it comes to kids, elementary school level, and it's one of those things that it turns out I feel pretty good about. Like, I don't know what it was. I just, my brother was born when I was 11, so I had a little kid but I was just, and my mother was always just all about talking straight with kids. And so when later I found myself in these classrooms talking about big issues with little kids, it felt natural. But if you'd asked me about that, like 8 years ago, I would have said, you're crazy. I'll never do something like that. But you always seemed like you were comfortable.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it was always like that. I think I came into being comfortable with it. I think, God, I was such a young dad that I was just like stumbling all over the place. So I think that slowly I became comfortable talking to kids like that, but it wasn't automatic for sure. And I'm still I have a lot to learn, but should we go back and forth, and I'll ask you a question and then you go.
Sure.
Leaning to what you just said about being in classrooms, all of you, one of the first times I saw speak was at the American Library Association, and this is like, I think you had just come out with Counting on Community maybe, and I remember being like, hey, how's it going? Like, I was having a good day, and then I was like, how do you feel? And you were like, oh, I don't want to fucking talk in this. you're like I just want to make the book, like I don't want to be talking. And I was like, oh, you'll do fine, you'll do great. And then sure enough, you did great. I mean, it was not like a big audience, like all of you will find, and some of you already have that, like when you have a book, sometimes there's tons of people there and sometimes there's only two, but at that particular day it was like a really small audience. So I was just wondering, like, how's the transition from like talking then to like, how's it feel now when you're talking to people?
Yeah, it's interesting. When A is for Activists first came out, my publisher came out here and he was like, yeah, we're going to get you on tour. I'm like, nah, that's not going to happen. Because, I can write books. And, you don't have to be, this my whole thing was like, I already wrote the book. I also illustrated. Do I have to also talk about it? Like that's, the book's out in the world, and the book is for me an intimate, thing between me and my kid. You and the kid on your lap kind of thing is how I wrote that book. It wasn't written to be, a performance, and I'm not a performer. And I used to take my kid to things, and you could tell when it was a good performer, somebody was good at engaging with kids, that was great, and when they weren't, then it was kind of okay, we'll move
Painful.
on to the next thing. Painful, exactly. And so I didn't want to force people to have to listen to me talk about stuff, and that really, and like I said, it's like I live with a bunch of teachers and people who are really good at working with kids, and that had never been my world before. I think the thing that changed for me was actually getting into the planetarium book, the books that once we got into kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, that age group, where we could actually have a conversation about the issues in it. That's where I said, like, I found myself feeling good about the interactions I was having with kids and realizing that it was actually useful what I was doing. I wasn't just out there trying to sell books. In fact, most of these kids are not book buyers themselves.
Right.
That's when I'm talking to parents. But when I'm talking to the kids, particularly in classrooms, I actually really like going to full classrooms of kids that are roughly in the same age group. It's their house, so they're comfortable, they're with their friends.
And the questions they ask.
Yeah, and the question, and it's just, for me, that's been a really fun discovery that that I could actually enjoy that part of it. I think there's a way in which children's books, for a lot of people, are this very sort of isolated experience of sort of like it's all in your head, and then you put it out on paper, and then you work with an illustrator or you illustrate it, but it's all like, it's sort of this undercover kind of thing where you have to do it, maybe you have some kids involved, but I think for me the thing that gave me confidence was actually getting it out in the world, and then and the idea that these children's books, or books in general, they're not your book. They're not like, I'm not there for 99.9% of the people that are reading the book. It's not about me telling this story. It's actually something that needs to live on its own, in all these multiple spaces, and you have to kind of imagine who's reading it, who's reading it to who, is, and how, and sort of how to make sure that that experience that you're imagining happening is not just only in my head, but that I actually, test it out. I get feedback from families that are in the target audience, from kids themselves, to make sure that, when by the time I do get to a point where I'm out there talking about my book with kids, sharing the story in it, that I know that there's there's a predictable exchange that's going to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of the coolest or most rewarding things about making a picture book is when a child or a family or a teacher comes up to you to tell them how the book made them feel, because it really is living beyond you. Like, it's no longer about you, it's about the story. So it is really cool.
I was maybe this is changing the subject, but it's back to sort of the publishing side of things. I remember we did talk early on, and I'd met with Janine as well, and when you asked me about my experience, I think at that point I had moved from self-publishing to 7 Stories, and I think I'd actually said at the time, if you ask me, get a publisher, because it's so much easier. And and I agree, like, having gone through the process of doing it myself, that was really valuable to me. But I also, I came out of owning a print shop, I came out of starting a design business, I'm an illustrator, and now I'm writing.
Plenty
and so
of shit to do.
Right, I knew a lot of those pieces, and it just seemed like it's a pretty steep learning curve to put all that stuff in together. But because I could make my own website, I could set up my own mailing station, I could set and even with all that, while it was interesting for a while, I didn't want to have to do that ongoing. I mean, Janine might be able to add some of this, to starting how the experience was actually running a publishing company where that is, ends up kind of, I believe, how that overtakes so much
takes
of
over
your
your life.
time,
Yeah.
and whether or not it's worth it, I think is kind of a question. But I guess that's the question. It's like, why did you end up deciding to go the self-publishing route? Did it have to do with just the, like, knowing what the publishing world was like, or was it like a conscious decision that you really wanted to do that, and for some other reason?
I chose that route because I wanted to learn. I basically wanted to learn what I didn't know, which was, for one, like having an idea is one thing, and being just the illustrator is one thing, which I probably could have had a career doing that, but I knew that I wasn't going to really understand the storytelling if I didn't write something as well. And so that's why, and I knew that my writing wasn't, that great yet. So I wanted to basically practice and like try to do something as good as I possibly could. And then, I mean, the book has been successful, much more than I would have ever thought. And so I think that I have learned a lot from that. And that was my goal, to just try to learn more about it. And then after the book was created, just learning all of the different parts of the design process and like what it takes to, make it an entire package and make it actually feel like something tangible that you want to hold in your hand. I think that's why I did it. And then after that, I think I just wanted like some self-control and like basically being able to not do it completely by myself, but to have some control and like go at my own pace, I guess is a way I would put it. I mean, I'm a huge fan of hip hop and culture and music and stuff. And so much of that growing up was seeing people who were attached to major, large record companies and record deals, and people who were equally as talented, who were, on a much smaller level, but taking control of the reins and kind of, putting their career in their own hands. And so I think that's why I did it. Looking back, I think I would still do that. So, okay, I have my question for you. So everybody knows right now that having like politically conscious books, or having quote unquote woke books, or things that have a political thing to them, are like really hot. And there's, people who like traditionally would have published that, like AK Press or PM Press or Haymarket Books or something like that. But then there's like new people who are, larger companies like Scholastic or Harper, that while they may have done some things here and there in the past, they're like really trying to jump on it now. And so I was wanting to get your feedback on what you think about trends versus like sticking with your gut. Because I remember when you first came out, you had approached some of the publishers and they were not feeling A is for Activists, but then when it blew up, when it popped, they were like, oh, we might could work with A is for Activists. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, and actually Angela also had a question about activism in children's books, so maybe we can both talk about that specifically. But I guess I'm sort of a Big Tent person, and if, this is actually my story in MS for Movement, is I think that, the idea that the mainstream is going to try to co-opt our ideas, and for me, is a win. It wasn't, it was my book. There was the Kate Schatz's Red American Women, it had Angela Davis on the cover and it became a New York Times bestseller, so, the time, whatever it was, the times were right. There was a number of books at the time that were sort of changing what was allowed. Not that people hadn't written books like that before, but for some reason at that time, it seemed like it became more possible. And then after Trump was elected, I think, the book, if you go to the bookstores, there's all these primers on, how to become an activist for kids kind of thing. I don't think that, I guess I'm arrogant enough to think that what I'm doing is different.
It is.
I mean, so I don't see it as challenging or as competition to what I'm doing. I feel like it's people trying to do stuff like that, which is, all power to them, but they're not going to hit it because those companies are what they are, and what they're trying to do is sell books, and that's,
Right.
Maybe that's better than some of the other crap they were publishing before, but at the same time, I don't see it as, it's going to be a loss for what we're doing. I think the sort of and this goes for books on activism and also sort of the sort of own voices stuff. I think you can't actually co-opt the authenticity piece of it. So they can try, but if hopefully that'll open and more doors, more gateways to other people finally finding the real thing. I don't know. I was going to ask you. I mean, that sort of similarly around the like Furkan and self-publishing it. I feel like maybe there's more of this. I would feel frustrated because it has to do with the avenues of distribution rather than the quality of the book. Like Furkan came out and you self-published it. There were some other books on similar themes around hair and haircut, kind of thing that kind of became, that were published by bigger houses. And, how did you feel about that? Would that have changed how you would have approached it, knowing that they were actually open to the subject?
Well, I think, yeah, the question of distribution is just like, it's just going back to like, you don't know what you don't know. So when I started, I didn't fully understand what it means to distribute a book. And for those listening who don't know, like there are two huge companies now, almost like one, who are in charge of distributing books to libraries, bookstores, organizations, so many places. And in some sense, they have a monopoly. And in some sense, it just makes it really easy for if you're a teacher or a bookstore owner or something like that, to be able to get your hands on 15 different titles coming from different publishers and different backgrounds and all that. But yeah, there have been several books that came out about hair at the same time, and before and after. And I was just really excited to see them, just because I remember having a conversation with the bookstore owner, and she was like, I didn't know there was so much, passion about Black hair. And I was like, well, yeah, there's still laws like keeping people from getting a job or being discriminated against. I mean, we just saw that case of that kid who wasn't going to walk the stage because he had locks still, you know what I mean? Like there's still so much about Black hair that I was excited to see all those other books. I felt it like as like a all seas, would they say that quote, like all seas rise? Like, I'm probably butchering it, but anyway, those books helped my book as well, because they would put it on the same list. And I think it helps children regardless, just to be able to access more things like that. I was just laughing the other day because I have this book that's about like artists, and they put 2 artists of color on the cover, and then the majority of the book is mostly white artists. But I was looking at the back of it, and it really pissed me off because they had another book that was like explorers, and this is one of the big 5, and it was like Christopher Columbus, and I was like, I was just like, they're hopping on the trend, trying to make it pop. But anyway, yeah, I think that the thing that I was getting at was like, it's hard to stick to your gut and stick to your guns when everyone is telling you like, this is what you should do that we know does work. So that's why I was wondering, how you thought about, sticking to your guns or sticking to your gut.
Yeah, I mean, and that came up early, and even writing A's for Activists, there were things where I was like, well, this is gonna be an issue in a lot of places, talking with kids. I mean, T is for trans, LGBTQ, these kind of issues. And they are in some places, like in Indonesia. The reason my book is not in Indonesian is because nobody will do L is for LGBTQ in Indonesia right now. And it was at various points, it was originally printed, when Seven Stories printed it, they had a print shop in China and they couldn't print it, so I ended up moving to Singapore. So there are sort of real political issues there. But for me, I guess at the time I remember going like, I want to be, whatever I'm doing, I want it to work for kids first and foremost. Like it has to be, these are kids' books. They're the most important piece of it. Second level is I want to be on the right side of history. It's not about I'm not trying to make this as sellable as possible. I want it to be the things that I think need to be in the book, and I think that's actually ended up serving the book well. I mean, I guess it could have gone the other way, but so far, you know, this was, you know, I think with some of those topics that before would have, you know, at the time seemed like they would have been a problem for a children's book. You know, the Fox News people did spend a whole bunch of time researching me and writing
Really?
weird things. Yeah, it's so, you know, there's been a number of times where it's come up in various contexts like that, and then there's like all these crazy people doing their research on the internet and writing to each other, and I would read these things, and it was interesting. They discovered it quite a bit.
They're like,
you know,
he was in a BDSM performance one year. No.
Yeah, I know. It's like I knew Barack Obama, and that was, you know, that
Wow.
was a big issue. So this became a conspiracy that Obama's family must have been behind this because
Whoa, I didn't even see that. That's
yeah,
hilarious.
his sister was my best friend growing up and all this kind of stuff, you know. But it hasn't come to anything, and it didn't increase my sales because I knew at the time that the book, you know, was because I was doing my own distribution. I could tell if there was something that caused a bump in sales, and
Right.
you know, they'd say, oh, if controversy is a good thing for sales, but it actually didn't do anything. It just kind of went into its own world and disappeared. Like they're just talking to each other.
Right.
And so, I mean, I'm sure there's another
Right.
level where it can actually be a problem. But so far for my book, the controversy hasn't been good for it, but being sort of true to its values is actually, I think, has been.
Let's
It'd be great actually to now bring in some other people too. I see that
questions.
Carmen
Yeah.
wrote a question, but do you want to just come on and bring your voices in? I think we could just make this more collective.
Yes.
I think Angela posted a few questions before I did.
All right, Angela, is there one that you want to come back to that they haven't kind of addressed?
No, I think they both have. You know, I think, you know, did about the activism piece of it and that critique piece of it. I guess, Rob, I wasn't exactly sure, like, have you received any of that from your books in terms of critiques of activism and having an activist platform for the types of books that you write?
I think that in the Black community, there was definitely like some eyebrow raising at it being in Spanish too at first. Like there was some people who were kind of like not really sure what to make of that. And then there were Afro-Latino people or people who speak Spanish as their first language who were like, yeah, they were like super excited. I think I've not faced as much criticism, I guess, on mine. But yeah, I'm going back to your question about like building community. I think one of the funnest things was getting a bunch of these, you know, awesome creators together and saying, let's just have dinner and, you know, talk shit about what we do. Like all the people we hate. No, I'm kidding. We would just get together and like basically just trade secrets or trade knowledge. And that was really a great way to not only get knowledge, but to just get to know other people who are doing things that were really cool. And then being involved in making the children's book event with everybody has been another one where you just get to meet people who are outside of your choir, your circle of immediate friends. And then I think all of us have had this happen where you become known as that person who does that thing, like kids books, and other people start to bring people to you. Be like, I have a friend, or I have a cousin, or I have someone who, you know, they have a question or they want to know something. And then like the rather than holding on to the knowledge, it starts to grow, and then you learn things from them. And I think that has been one of the most organic ways to build community in like a very real, sustained way. One of the other question is, I'm curious about what types of advice or suggestions you have both received to make your books more sellable, right? You know, you want to jump on that?
Sorry, I missed the bottom of that one. So
Carmen, why don't you say the question? You can add to it, or if there's any.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was just curious because just about the whole marketing and yeah, just like when you're trying to get your book to a publisher or when you were out submitting your book, like what were things that people said that they thought would make your book more sellable? Like you were talking about having the Spanish in there, you know, where people like, oh, you're going to lose a whole audience if you have Spanish and this should be a Black book or a Latino book. I'm just curious about like how people, what kind of messages you guys got about how to make your books more sellable?
Yeah, I mean, you probably have more experience with that, and also I think, I mean, Laura and Janine knowing the book industry more. My my thing was, you know, I was kind of naive about it all, so I just went ahead and did the book the way I wanted to do it. And I'm really lucky to have a publisher that is pretty hands off. Like he just, for some reason, you know, whatever I do, he's okay with and doesn't push back much on stuff. But I understand that that's not actually most people's experience with publishers. And you know, and I've never had an agent either, so I think maybe that's something, Rob, it might be interesting to hear more about how that experience has gone for you. Um, I've occasionally, you know, I've had things like where, you know, we debated the title, for instance, for M is for movement. I had referred to it as that, but I didn't actually think that was going to be the title. I was going to, am I still on? I'm getting a message. Okay. I wanted to call it the Humans Don't Eat Golf Balls. And that ended up being the subtitle. And the interesting thing is I read that out, you know, when I take it to classrooms, I ask all the, you know, people, when I'm talking to all these kids, they'll be like, how come it's called, you know, Humans Can't Eat Golf Balls? And it's like, so I'll tell them the story, and then I'll be like, well, you know, how many kids here think the title should have been M is for movement? How many kids think golf balls? And, you know, 90% of the kids would have preferred it golf balls, but that was a marketing decision that that my publisher made based on his understanding of, you know, for him, my books are going to sell as the author of A is for Activist, not necessarily on their own. And marketing wise, he's probably right. Like if, you know, book came out, didn't have my name on it, you know, I'm competing, you know, especially at middle grade, it's a whole nother thing. And books like A is for Activist and Counting on Community, I think a lot of those have done a lot better, partially because of the market that it's for, but you know, the parents are buying these books at that grade, at those ages, right? And so for them to be able to know what it is from the title on the shelf, and I think that makes a big difference in sellability of books. But I think in terms of content, I wouldn't have changed anything for that purpose, and nor would my publisher have asked for it. Like, he's very clear that he's not, you know, for him, that's not the driving force around and why he publishes books. And that's sort of a somewhat unique thing to a small publisher with a political agenda.
Yeah, maybe I think, you could. Yeah, I was gonna say that I've gotten some feedback in the past that's, you know, asked me to not from necessarily kids book people that much, but you know, to shoo away a little bit from more political themes. Can everybody hear me still? And I think when it comes to sellable, I just kind of go back to specificity and story. And I think that, you know, if your story is about something that everyone has experienced and you tell it in like a general way, you know, to make sure you don't offend everyone, or like basically keep it hella bland and not spicy, then people just kind of walk right past it. But like, I think the more specific you are about your story, and like who you are as a person and things that really, really light you up inside, I think the more people, oddly enough, will gravitate to it, just because they haven't seen that before and they're curious about it, or, you know, doesn't matter if they come from the same background, they can somehow like find something that aligns with that story. And I think that working with an agent and working with multiple publishers, I think that pretty much everyone has given me that advice for the most part, to like, you know, be very specific. And they haven't said sellable, but I generally tend to think like that is something that makes a book more interesting. So, and I think that no matter what story it is, or how specific or weird it is, like if it's, you know, appropriate, you know, for kids, like if it's odd and weird, like that's okay, and that's a good thing. Somewhere out there's some other people who want that odd and weird thing.
Well, thank you.
Does anyone else have either a question or a comment? I mean, Janine, Natalie, Angela, you all have done publishing before. Or Maya, is there anything you are curious about?
So my question is for both of you because you're both writer and illustrator. And also, I want to say it's so good to see you. I feel like it's been a while.
Yeah,
I
it's good to
know.
see you too.
We got together. So I'm wondering how, and it's from what I understood, you were first illustrators and visual artists. So I'm wondering how that background impacts your writing process and how do you make it work? How do you go about, you know, illustrating the story also that you wrote?
I will start. For me, when I was practicing, I would often do an image first and then write second. So I would do an image and then write a paragraph or a few lines afterwards. And I coupled that with just reading tons and tons of books to understand like economy of words, like not putting too many words in there and like making sure it was like you're not using the same phrases too many times. But I think the illustration for me is just like make it super interesting visually first to draw the eye in, and then, you know, really work on the writing, which I'm still doing, to make it a story that you want to read more than once, pretty much.
Would you ever write a book for someone else to illustrate?
I did.
Which one?
It's called Hannah on Stage. It's
Okay.
an early reader, and they wouldn't let me illustrate it, y'all. I was like, can I? And they were like, nope. So, but it was fun. It was really fun to write something and see what the illustrator did with it, to be on the other side of it. Yeah.
Oh, I missed that. Sorry.
No, I didn't
I was
promote
gonna-
it that much. So.
I mean, that, because that's always, you know, like the idea of illustrating a book that you don't write when you're an illustrator is not a, you know, is common, but the idea of going the other way around does seem like a much bigger leap.
Yeah.
Rob, were you allowed to give illustrators notes on that story, or did you really have to back off and just let the illustrator go on its own journey?
I think they might have let me give some notes, but being an illustrator, I didn't want to tell them to do anything. I was like, do your thing, you know, go ham with it.
How did you feel about it when it came out?
Oh, I thought it was great. I thought she did a great job. It was beautiful. Only thing I wanted was it to be a different binding, but that's some nerdy other stuff.
Now, Carmen has another question. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet who's burning to do so now? All right, Carmen.
Well, I was just going to ask, one of the things that we're often doing in our group is like sharing different resources and tools and strategies. And I just wondered if there were any like websites or books or classes or things like that that you all took on your journey that might be helpful for us to know about.
Well, I would like to take Laura's class too. So I would say that you're on to a great start there. You know, what about you?
I didn't take any classes, but you know, I think I ended up connecting with, part of it, this was my whole naivete about the whole thing. I didn't really know the world at all. I connected with Maya afterwards, and you know, discovered that there were all these resources out there. But yeah, I'm trying to think of, you know, for me, the in some ways, I'll be honest, trying to not be too embedded in the kidlit world was actually a plus. And I would, you know, I think if I had gone to all the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators stuff, and I'd got, you know, if I had been to all these ALA meetings, if I'd been to all that stuff before I wrote my book, I would have never written my first book. I would have been like, oh, this is not a world that I would be able to please any of these people, you know. And so I think Laura has talked about true north idea of having it be, you know, for the children first, and actually having the various kids in my community being more of my sounding board on all this kind of stuff has been a positive thing, because then by the time I was thrust into the kidlit world, I was there with some level of confidence that what I was doing actually works. And otherwise I would have, you know, I went to what I think it was the Society of the American Booksellers Association Children's Book Institute, and there was this person, this panel where this author had written a cool little book for their kid, about their kid on vacation. And it was just like hand sketched, you know, funny little, you know, kind of edgy, irreverent little handmade book. And then she talked, and then she had her her editor, publicist, or I'm not sure what the position was, there, you know, sitting there with her, and they talked about how they then revised that to make it into a real children's book and publishable. And the original was so much better, as far as I'm concerned. You know, what they basically took the soul out of the book to make it, you know, mainstream publishable. And so, in some ways, I think, you know, you're talking to the right people when you have, you know, like Laura and Maya and Izetta, and, you know, people who are actually doing things a little bit outside of just, you know, because there is so much, there are a lot of resources out there about how to become a children's book author. And there's so many people who that's, you know, their life dream. And there's so many people taking advantage of that. So I would say, I don't have any good immediate resources.
Well, you mentioned Maya.
Yeah.
Maya Gonzalez. So her class reflection. So I'll see if I can type that into the chat.
I'm not sure they're teaching that class.
Yeah, they're not teaching.
I think the resources can be available if you reach out to them kind of directly. And they have got incredible resources. I mean, everything they collected.
Yeah, that's. Well, the person who we're talking about, they're like, you know, they're not doing it traditional way. They're just like, screw the traditional way. Everybody's, you know, thinking about how you should, you know, whatever, 3-act structure and like all the different things. Like, we're gonna do it our way. And in so many ways, like, that's what we need to see, and that's what we need to hear, to counteract all of the books that are just kind of very similar.
Angela, do you want to, you're with your thinking about the creative, supporting the creative person's journey, do you have any relevant question to Rob and Eno?
That's a great question. So what Laura's talking about is I've been doing, just with everything that we've been going through, with this crazy, interesting time that we're in, really thinking about, I guess, my journey as a writer. And it kind of speaks to what you both have been saying, is like that true north of staying true to who I am and what I'm interested in. But there's an emotional journey, in addition to the working journey of being a writer. And so I guess I wonder, can you talk a little bit about that in terms of not just staying true to who you are, but just even coming to the page every day, coming to the computer every day, or the days that you can't, what you do instead, or how do you stay uplifted in a time where, I mean, right now it's feeling like open season on Black men, and it's really demoralizing. And it's really hard to feel like putting something on paper to send out into the world that I'm really upset with, and I don't really like right now, and I don't really like how it works, but somehow I have to stay committed to the fact of what I want to do and what I want to put out there. But I'm really curious to know, like, how do other authors, and especially authors of color, continue with their emotional journey or taking care of themselves emotionally?
I mean, if I could say something, I would just say, like, you know, using that that marathon that Nipsey Hussle would always say before he was killed, is like the marathon versus a sprint. You know, like, we as people have come through so much, and like it's been so many, you know, centuries of this, that we have to, like, it's, whether it be physical or mental, like, take breaks and come back to it, and that there's a longer journey ahead. I guess I feel like we're always going to be fighting in some sense. But I think what, you know, like the title of his new book, or like what was it, you know, what we're for, right?
Yeah.
I think that's important too, is like to be able to highlight the victories, and to highlight the things that we do love, the things that bring us happiness, and like not let the world steal our thunder or steal our joy or happiness. To, like, yeah, it's tough. And I think that's the reason why, you know, the past 2 years I've like taken a step back a little bit from social media, just because it's taxing mentally. It's like I don't even want to see the video anymore, like, you know. Yeah, I feel you. You know, you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar question for activism in general, right? Like, I sort of come out of the activist world, and this is, you know, my whole framework for much of my younger activist years, why I was willing to work 16-hour days and all this kind of stuff was, you know, people who had gotten killed fighting for things that, you know, I'm privileged to be able to even be a part of that movement, you know, and I knew people who ended up getting killed doing what they're doing. What I was doing seemed easy, and I felt like you know, there's a kind of, you know, sort of martyr thing that I think is not healthy, you know, and but this was kind of the world that I was in, where you know, the idea is like, you know, who am I to complain about the work I need to do, you know, considering, and that got a lot of things done because, you know, it gave me a very much more single focus. I think I've shifted a bit from that nowadays. I think especially when we're talking about creative work, I think you have to be in the right mindset, conditions, environment, or whatever to be able to do good creative work, right? And we all, as creative people, all struggle with that. You know, how do you create that space? And I'm struggling with this right now with the COVID thing because all my roommates are home, and this is not my best creative space to have so many people in the house. Like, I want them to all go to work so that I can actually work. But I also do a lot of just forgiving myself. Like, I don't, you know, it's like, it's okay, do what is inspiring to you right now, even that if it isn't actually what you're supposed to be doing, because, you know, people can call it procrastination or whatever, but actually that procrastination is half of that turns into not half, but, you know, 2% of that turns into something useful. And that's actually how I find the things that end up being useful, is usually because I'm doing something I'm not supposed to and doing in the first place.
Like rock climbing.
Yeah, or whatever.
Yeah, I would add on to that as well. Like, yeah, I think that is probably a very for everybody who's creative, it's like, God, I should be doing this, or I should have that already. Or I think even when something happens, like another brother getting shot by the police, I often think, as a artist who's done activist artwork before, or something speaking to an issue, like, damn, I should have a piece like that ready to go to respond to it. And sometimes I don't. Like, sometimes my sanity is just being able to go hug my kid, you know, and that's all I have at the moment. But yeah, I think that, back to your point, Angela, about like getting back to the page, I think what was really helpful for me is assigning myself, I mean, and like I some people criticize me for it as well. It's like assigning projects to do, like little things, and like that helps me get the creative juices flowing. Like, it could be an art challenge, it could be, you know, I'm going to do 4 of this or something. I have so many of them, but it's helpful that at least for me, like, I like to go from project to project, and they all kind of feed each other. So I think it's helpful to come back to the page by like giving yourself fun stuff to do, in addition to the hard things, just to kind of like keep that muscle going, as if you were, you know, if you're going to the gym to train a fighter, you wouldn't run a mile every day or use, you know, kicks every day. You just like alternate it and like work on the whole body, so to speak. But that's probably a horrible metaphor, but anyway.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I could listen to you guys talk all day, but I feel like we should respect your and everyone else's time. I don't know if anyone has a final kind of thought or question that you want to share. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
No, it's okay.
nope, you go.
It's just something I'm throwing out there. I was very quickly thinking, this is going to be popcorn. David Wisner is known for making picture books that are mainly pictures and then no words. Got me started of the silent movie movement, but that actually brought me, like in current times, to silence as a form of protest. So you both being visual artists, and again, you don't really need to answer that. I feel like I'm just more like throwing a seed out in the universe, and we'll see whatever comes back from it. But I was wondering if at some point you think of your career, you might also consider work putting out a book, you're both activists, so I know there's gonna be a message behind, but like, do you think you might at some point have a project where you're telling a story only with pictures and no words? And again, I'm framing that back to the, like as a form of silent protest. This is just personal to me. It doesn't have to mean the same thing for you. That's just a question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Janine gave me a book once that was incredible. It was like a very short story about like a dog that had wings. You remember that book, Janine? It was a beautiful picture book, and it was no words. And I think there's some beauty in that, because anyone from any language can see it and, get the story. What about you,
I'd have to think about it. Funny, because when it comes to books, back to sort of that earlier question around sort of illustration, and for me, it's actually, I do my writing separate from my illustration. Like, it's easy to do the illustration actually, but I have to sit down and I have to be in sort of my words part of my head, and then once that's all done, I can easily switch and illustrate it. So I don't actually go back and forth between those two, and so it would be an interesting exercise for me to think about. Like, I can always visualize how to illustrate something, but and I've always been confident in my writing, but I think that's kind of where creating the space where I'm actually going to be able to have that story come full circle using words is, for me, a whole different headspace from when I'm doing the illustration part. So it would be to try to think about how I would tell that story only with illustrations theoretically would be easy, but I would almost have to write it first.
Thank you both.
Rob, did you find the title?
I didn't. I know I have it somewhere, but my wife has moved around some of my books of late, so I do not know where it is. I will find it though.
All right. All right, Angela, why don't we close off with your...
I was going to ask if each of you could recommend one book that has inspired you, either throughout your life or recently.
I'm gonna call. Wait.
Did you hear the question, Ina?
Yeah, sorry, I have to think about that for. Go ahead.
Damn it! I was hoping you were gonna have one ready.
Any genre.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be a kid's book. It can be anybody.
All right, I have one. It's called Dread Nation. Has anyone read that book? Yeah, no, I've read it. Okay, so Dread Nation is a YA book. It's I would say it's a substantial read. It won't take you forever, but for me, if you're a slow reader, it took me like a month or something. It's basically a historical fiction book. So it's about the time right around the Civil War. And what happens is the army on both sides of the Union and what was the other side called? I forget. Both sides of the army, after they're shot and killed, they wake up and become zombies, and they start to eat the soldiers who are alive, who are fighting. And so there are these just whole swaths of the South that are just covered in zombies, and there are little strongholds in major cities where they've walled off the city and stuff like that. And white folks in particular train Black girls to be warriors who use skice, I think they call them, for like farming, to fight back. And I won't give it away, but it's a really awesome story about them being trained and etiquette and like race and them trying to contain the zombies, and what happens when they try to contain. So that's a really good story. It's called Dread Nation by Justina Ireland.
I'll just add that there was some controversy about that book.
Was there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was actually about the representation of indigenous stories, and Debbie Reese had some criticism. Yeah. And so it became a little bit of a kerfuffle. So if you just want to fully immerse in the story.
Yeah.
Or not.
Okay, you gotta have a book now. I still don't have something that's really good for recently. The book that always comes to mind for me, it was this book by Susan George called Another World is Possible If. So that's nonfiction, but I was, for some reason, when people ask me what book has influenced me a lot, I feel like, you know, because I guess maybe because it has to do with this question, you know, the Another World Possible framework has been out there for a long time. It's very inspirational, nothing against it, but, you know, there is some devils in the detail about how we can actually get from here to there.
It's funny you say that too, because growing up as a kid, both of my parents are, you know, young communists, and they had a big ass poster of the world breaking through change that said that another world is possible in my living room. Talking to other kids, like, you got that poster? And they're like, no.
I know I had wouldn't it be great if we spent on children's playgrounds instead of the military, you know, with a picture of the playground and
right.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys. It's been great to see you and welcome you into this community that has been, I think, a bit of an oasis for everyone.
And thanks for having us. I hope it was useful. And, you know, we normally, both Rob and I have the rule against doing panels that are all men, but since this is supposed to be more of a round table, and we trust your choices, Laura. So I hope that this was not just us talking, and somehow we can be. And feel free to, if there's any other questions that come up, I'm infinitely available on email these days, or call me.
Yeah, and both of your emails addresses are on. I think I sent the last one today. I included you guys on it. So if you're needing either of their email addresses, you can find them there.
Great to see everybody.
Thank you. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cannot wait to see all the books y'all come up with.
Have a good week.